Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Simon Gerlach, and I'm from Copenhagen and a psychologist and animal rights activist. And today I'm going to present the research that I did for the writing of my master's thesis in psychology this spring. The title of the thesis was People's Morally Inconsistent Relationships with Other Animals, and with Professor Melanie Joy's carnism theory, which many of you are probably familiar with. As a starting point, my research has focused on the cognitive and social factors that support such an extreme example of moral inconsistency as we see in the case of people's behavior towards non-human animals. In my presentation today, I'll present these factors and connect them to activism to see how we can use these psychological insights to become more effective. So, what does moral inconsistency look like? Most people believe that it's wrong to harm animals, but still most people eat meat, which necessarily means harming and killing animals. Never before in history have we consumed as much meat globally as we do today, which could imply that people basically don't care about animals. But, as we all know, this is clearly not the case. Most people find animal suffering morally repulsive, and along with the rise in meat consumption, we have seen a rise in the economical expenses people spend on their companion animals. People regard companion animals as equal family members. They grieve when they die, and they have funerals for them, and even companion animals cemeteries. But along with this, for many years, and I'm sure many other animal rights activists as well, have been puzzled whenever witnessing a new media story come out about the killing of one animal, and then the whole public outcry that follows with these stories. In Denmark, we have had several incidents of this, like whaling in the Faroe Islands, and I think most famously, Copenhagen Zoo's killing of the baby giraffe Marius, which sparked heavy debates worldwide and resulted in moral condemnation and even death threats, mostly from people who also supported the killing of plenty of other animals on a daily basis. And I think many of us have been asking the same question. Why do people become so upset about the death of one animal, but don't even lift an eyebrow, and in many cases even directly supporting when other animals are killed? And how can we make people become as emotionally upset about the killing of the animals that are used for food, clothes, experiments, etc.? This question has been the driving force of my research. I'll start out by making a big spoiler and jump directly to the conclusions. To sum it up, I have two answers to the question, why are we so morally inconsistent when it comes to animals? The first is, we are not as rational as we like to think we are. According to psychological research, it's not that strange that we have an inconsistent moral relationship with other animals. Not strange at all, rather the opposite actually. Humans are inconsistent in almost everything we do, which of course also applies to our morality. So we are morally inconsistent in general, not only when it comes to animals. But still it seems that we're even more inconsistent when it comes to non-human animals, and this, I believe, is a result of speciesist and anthropocentric structures in society that both materially and discursively supports moral inconsistency towards other animals. So, to sum it up, irrational minds plus speciesist social structures gives us a morally inconsistent relationship to other animals. And hopefully you'll have a better idea of what I mean with this when I'm done with my speak. So my presentation will be structured around the theories of three central figures from the moral psychological field: Jonathan Hyde, Martin Hoffman, and Albert Bandura. So, Jonathan Hyde, he's an American psychologist, and according to him, our morality is not as rooted in rationality as has been presumed since the Enlightenment. Moral psychological research has been occupied with the role of reasoning in moral judgments, but according to Hyde, intuition and emotion are much more important and influential for our moral judgments. And this also fits much better with what we already know about our psychological functioning. where automatic, fast, and resource-efficient processes take rank over the slower, conscious reasoning that also requires a much higher effort. Hyde also argues that moral emotions co-varies a lot more with moral behavior than moral reasoning does, and he uses psychopaths as an example of this. They are perfectly aware rationally about the social codes and norms of behavior in society, but they don't feel the consequences if they break them, and so they become indifferent about them. Which means they are able to act against social and moral codes without feeling bad about it. Our moral judgments stem from an immediate intuitive feeling that something is right or wrong, and only afterwards do we engage in moral reasoning. A reasoning that is highly biased since its primary function is to justify the intuitive judgment. A recent study beautifully shows this. Psychological researchers made a study where participants were asked to fill out questionnaires about the cognitive capabilities and moral worth of different non-human animals. The trick in the study was that some participants were fed beef jerky before filling out the questionnaire, while others were fed nuts. The results showed that not only did the persons who just ate meat from a cow underestimate the cognitive capability and moral value of cows, but in fact, it spread to all other animals that they had a lower moral concern for them as well. And since what you just ate shouldn't influence your moral judgment, this, if it was based in rationality, this study shows us that morality is thus susceptible for irrelevant influence. And much in line with Hyde's point, we see that people's moral judgments seem to justify their own initial intuitions and previous behavior. People are more concerned with fitting into their social group and perceiving themselves as coherent and without internal contradictions than they are with finding objective truths. As Hyde puts it, the process of moral reasoning looks more like a lawyer trying to win a case than like a scientist trying to uncover an objective truth. So, according to Hyde, our morally inconsistent relationships with other animals can be understood as a result of intuitive judgments rather than rational considerations. And the moral intuitions are both innate and culturally influenced, which means that in a given culture, certain moral intuitions will be socially reinforced and thus eventually become embodied moral values, while others will not be reinforced, and thus these intuitions become weaker and lesser accessible. Hyde has developed a model of human moral judgment called the social intuitionist model, and I'll now explain and relate this model to our human-non-human moral relationships. The model has 6 links, as you can see behind me. A triggering event can activate person A's moral intuition, which through the first link, intuitive judgment, leads to A's moral judgment. The second link in the process is post hoc reasoning, where person A is searching for arguments to back up her initial judgment. Link 3 and 4 are the social components of the model. In link 3, reason persuasion, person A is trying to persuade person B about her moral judgment with rational arguments. And this probably doesn't have such a big effect unless you succeed in evoking new moral intuitions in the other, but I'll get back to that later. Link 4 is the unconscious social persuasion, and this can go both ways depending on the interpersonal relationship between person A and B. If A and B have a good interpersonal relationship, then A's moral judgment will automatically influence B's judgment and make it more possible that they will be aligned. But if A and B have a bad interpersonal relationship, then A's implicit social persuasion will have the opposite effect. And I think this is of great importance when we as activists talk to carnists about veganism. If we are not very careful in doing this, I think I can be afraid, at least, that we easily end up unconsciously socially persuading people to not go vegan because they don't want to be part of our group. Link 5 and 6 are the rational components of the model, which are still of importance, but just not as important as presumed earlier in the moral psychological field. Link 5, reasoned judgment, shows how purely rational arguments can sometimes influence the person's initial moral judgment, which creates a conflict between intuition and rationality. Rationality can overrule intuition, but this is assumed to be extremely rare in practice and might only be really common among philosophers, according to Hyde. So link 6, private reflection, is essentially where the potential for changing moral intuitions and thus changing people's moral judgments and their moral behavior lie. This link shows the occasional event when a person engaged in private thinking spontaneously activates new intuitions that might contradict the original intuition. This process is mostly activated through role-taking, where you imagine yourself in another person's shoes with all the vicarious emotional responses that follows. Role-taking and vicarious emotional responses are key components of empathy, and even though Hyde doesn't use the empathy term himself, I would suggest that the sixth link of the model stresses empathy's central role for moral judgment, since it's only through this empathy link that people can change their own moral intuitions. Let's take two different triggering events and see how they apply to the model: eating a pig and eating a dog in a Western cultural context. So, if we assume that the triggering event is to be served pig meat, then the first thing we might consider is whether this will even work as a triggering event, since it has to be perceived as a moral situation before the whole moral judgment process starts. And in a society like ours, where eating pigs is seen as one of the most normal and common things to do, it's questionable if it will even be perceived as a moral situation. But if we imagine that getting served pig meat can't function as a moral situation, then I will assume that the moral intuition for far most people will be that it is completely morally acceptable to eat pigs, since this intuition has been highly reinforced in our culture throughout childhood. Afterwards, the person, through post hoc reasoning, will make rationalizations to back up the initial intuition. These might be the classical carnist arguments like animals eat other animals too, and humans cannot survive without meat, and pigs are stupid, completely instinct-driven, cannot feel pain, etc., etc. In the third link, these rationalizations can now be used to try to convince others about the moral rightfulness in eating pigs. This will probably not be very necessary, though, in a culture where it is seen as a given to eat pigs. Rather, it is the social persuasion in link 4 that has its impact, since you, almost no matter which social group you're in, besides animal rights communities and certain religious communities, of course, but elsewhere, then the behavior of your surroundings will probably confirm you in that it's morally okay to eat pigs. And this will reinforce the other person's moral intuition, and so it continues in a spiral of confirmation, reinforcement, and effectively upholding the status quo. Link 5 and 6 open up the possibilities of change and breaking the circle. But since link 5 is assumed to be extremely rare in the general public, evoking empathy in link 6 seems to be the most central component in changing pigs' moral status. How to evoke empathy will be the topic in a moment, but first I'll quickly go through the model with the other example, the serving of dog meat. And here we can imagine that the process will look radically different. First of all, it's very likely that most people will automatically perceive this as a moral situation. And most people will intuitively come to the moral judgment that it's wrong to eat dogs. And then the circle basically just continues like before, but just reinforcing the opposite intuition that eating dogs is morally okay. No, wrong. Quite important. And a classic mistake we as animal rights activists make is that we assume that we can convince carnists about going vegan by just providing enough rational arguments. And this is a fallacy. To truly influence and change other people's moral intuitions, we need to create new intuitions by having the other person taking the perspective of the absent third person, in this case the non-human animal. We need to invoke empathy in the other. We need to have them literally see it from the non-human animal in the slaughterhouse's point of view. As Hyde puts it more popularly, reasoning is cool, emotions are hot, and evoking empathy will activate the hot emotionally salient system rather than only the cold reasoning system. Empathy seems to me to be the most central component of our moral behavior, and thus also our moral relationships with other animals. And exactly empathy and how to evoke it will be the focus now. Martin Hoffman, another key psychologist in the moral psychological field, has in fact developed a whole empathy moral theory, where empathy is seen as a universal core motive for human pro-social behavior. According to Hoffman, empathy functions as an incitement to act in accordance with abstract moral principles like justice and care. According to Hoffman, there are 5 modes to evoke empathic arousal in people. The first 3 are the primitive ones, which are automatic, involuntary, and pre-verbal. The first 3 modes are mimicry, conditioning, and direct association. And without going into too much detail, the important thing is that these 3 modes result in an unconscious, automatic, empathic response, which is essential in early childhood and in face-to-face situations. Furthermore, these 3 modes rely on a certain degree of similarity between observer and victim to automatically invoke empathy. And of course, this means that it's easier to empathize and sympathize with someone if you can automatically and without any voluntary effort read their mental state, like if you encounter a chimpanzee or stand eye to eye with most mammals, especially those with traits like human babies, like big eyes and big round heads, compared to, say, a spider that is so physically different from you that it takes more of a voluntary effort to imagine what it might be like to experience the world from a spider's point of view. The 2 higher cognitive modes are more culturally influenced and under voluntary control. These 2 are mediated association and role or perspective taking. They are under voluntary control, but they can also be activated automatically by being attentive to the victim's distress or witnessing the victim's suffering, as Hoffman puts it. A point very similar to Melanie Joy's solution to break the carnism ideology by bearing witness to animal suffering. And these modes enables us to empathize with victims who aren't physically present. I think this division into pre-verbal and higher cognitive modes of empathic arousal is of great importance to understanding the moral inconsistent relationships with non-human animals. Because the first 3 modes are relying on face-to-face interaction with the victim, it makes perfect sense that these are not activated in situations where people eat meat. Since in these situations, the victim is no longer present as a living subject, but only as a dead, fragmented object. These first 3 modes are essential for empathy because not only do they enable a person to react on empathic arousal, they immediately, unconsciously, and automatically forces her to do it. The fact that these 3 modes are not activated in the main part of people's interactions with other animals, in eating their body parts, might be a key to understanding the morally inconsistent relationship. And it also helps explain why people can feel great empathy with their companion animals who are physically present for them as living subjects in their everyday lives. To be fair, the 2 higher modes can help people to empathize with absent victims like the animals they eat, but it doesn't happen automatically. So it definitely takes a greater effort to empathize with these animals compared to empathizing with a dog in your own living room. Martin Hoffman described that our empathy has some built-in limits and biases. The first is familiarity bias. First of all, we tend to favorize those perceived as part of our own in-group, our own gender, our own skin color, our own species, and those with similar preferences as ours. And several studies have shown this. Studies in social psychology have shown that categorization alone of in-group and out-group, like human, animal, male, female, etc., in itself leads to an exaggeration of perceived between-group differences and an exaggeration of perceived in-group similarity. In another study, where participants were shown film stimuli of animal suffering, both human and non-human animal suffering, the researchers monitored the participants' skin conductance, basically how much they sweated, as a sign of autonomic psychological arousal and distress. They also had participants evaluate their subjective experience of how difficult it was to watch the videos. And both people's self-reports and people's unconscious empathic reactions showed stronger signs of distress when an animal perceived to be closer to humans was harmed than when they thought it was an animal from another species perceived to be more different from humans. And another study again asked participants to rank animals on a scale according to their perceived similarity to humans. The same study asked another group of participants to rank the same animals, but in order of which animals they found most important to save from extinction. And the correlation between the two surveys was striking. The more the animals were perceived to be similar to humans, the more they were deemed worthy of saving. So it's clearly that we have this highly anthropocentric and human biased empathy. But again, it would be too simple to conclude that only the animals perceived to be similar to us can be included in the circle of compassion. Companion animals provide an interesting example of how the moral status of non-humans are fluid and highly culturally influenced. A whole range of different animal species have had status as companion animals for humans, including rats, cows, pigs, snakes, and even cockroaches. So it can't be similarity to humans alone that defines the lines of moral inclusion, even though it certainly has great impact. And there are other limits as well. Habituation. Studies have shown that we can become habituated to the suffering of a victim by repeated exposure to their distress, which leads to a decrease in empathy. And studies have also shown that in general we tend to feel more empathy towards a victim the more the victim is perceived to suffer, but only up to a certain point where witnessing the victim's suffering can become so stressful and painful for us that instead of an increase in empathy, we actually see the opposite. We shut down our empathy to protect ourselves. A point to keep in mind in relation to showing carnists the horror videos from the animal industry, that if we show them the worst of the worst to really try to convince them of the wrongness of eating animals, we might end up having them actually feeling more sad about themselves having to watch this horrible footage than they do about the animals in the footage. People react on others' distress for both egocentric reasons, because it's uncomfortable for us to watch others suffer, but also for altruistic reasons, because people are compassionate. And this combination of egoism and altruism creates a strong incitement to act on your empathy in situations where the suffering victim is directly observable for you, and if it's not very difficult for you to help alleviate the suffering. But in other situations where the empathic distress isn't triggered as much, for example because the victim is not present and other egocentric drives are strong, like the pleasure and the social accept of eating animals, then there will be a conflict of interests, where the drive to help might be overturned by other drives. So maybe it's not even a question of a lack of empathy when people eat animals, but simply because other drives win the competition. Finally, Martin Hoffman has an important point in regards of activism, at least I think. He states that because our empathy is biased and because it's a limited resource, a general and promiscuous empathy that encompasses every single animal on the planet is not possible. That's why we need to incorporate moral principles as well to be able to extend our pro-social behavior beyond the limits of our empathic scope. But even if we get everyone to accept or appreciate moral principles like animal equality, anti-speciesism, and not harming others, psychological and social mechanisms can still work in such a way that people act against their moral beliefs. Canadian psychologist Albert Bandura has made a theory of factors leading to moral disengagement, and thus a blockage of our empathy. He states that self-sanctioning is what keeps our behavior in line with our moral standards, but that certain social and psychological mechanisms can block these sanctions and make us behave in ways which are against our moral beliefs. I'll now go through some of these mechanisms and see how they apply to our moral relations with other animals. The first is moral justification. With this mechanism, violence is redefined as serving a higher purpose, and thus it appears socially and personally acceptable. This can explain moral disengagement towards animals exploited in the industry, where a widespread narrative is that eating animals is necessary for our health, for example, and that the animal industry serves a higher purpose by creating jobs for people and supporting public welfare through tax money, etc., etc. The next, euphemistic labeling. According to Bandura, our actions are based in linguistics, and thus euphemistic labeling can facilitate moral disengagement by linguistically neutralizing violent behavior. The animal industry is well aware of this, and they actively work to replace words like slaughterhouse and slaughter with meat plant and harvest. And cows are no longer cows, but dairy cows, and we don't eat pigs, we eat pork. And it also makes perfect sense that it's much more difficult to perceive the moral aspect in harvesting chicken compared to killing Marius the baby giraffe. The next mechanism, advantageous comparison. This is a mechanism where people, by comparing their acts to worse acts that other people do, their own behavior starts to seem more acceptable. We see this in relation to the animal industry as well, where another popular narrative, at least in Denmark, is that if we didn't produce the animals for food, fur, etc., then the production would just move to other countries where the animals are treated even worse. And we also see it with individual consumers, where they compare themselves to other consumers who buy animal products with even lower welfare standards than they do, the classic "I only buy organic" argument. Displacement and diffusion of responsibility. This mechanism reduces the individual's agentic role in the harmful acts by displacing or diffusing the responsibility of the acts to either authorities or to other individuals. This mechanism is highly relevant for explaining moral disengagement towards animals in the industry. First of all, the animal industry is a totally legal institution and is thus authorized by the state, and this makes it easier for the individual to displace the responsibility. Slaughterhouse workers also have highly specialized and specific tasks so that no single individual is personally responsible for the whole transformation process from a living animal into dead body parts. In the same way, the individual consumer is not responsible for the killing of a certain animal, first of all because the killing is undertaken by someone else, and also because animal flesh is demanded by such a big part of the population that the responsibility becomes diffuse. A study also found that people's exposure to animals' meat in supermarkets alone was a strong predictor for their willingness to eat these certain animals, because the presence of the dead animals in the supermarket means that other peoples are eating them on a regular basis, and thus it must be socially acceptable to eat them. Disregard or distortion of consequences. According to Bandura, it's easier to harm others if there's a distance, and this can be both in time and space, between your actions and its consequences. Today, most people in the global north live far away from places where animals are being abused and killed. And in our culture, the killing of animals is almost invisible. Thus, consumers' moral disengagement towards farmed animals makes sense, since there's a huge distance, both spatially and temporally, between the act of buying or eating meat and the killing of the animal. A point much in line with sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's characteristics of the conditions leading to Holocaust. Bauman claims that in modernity, with its technological possibilities, our actions have consequences that lie far beyond the horizon of our moral visibility, and so the actions lose their moral significance for us. Violence in modernity has far from disappeared, according to Bauman, but it has been removed from our field of view to isolated arenas inaccessible to most of the population. This has made the violence acceptable for most people, even though the same people find visible violence repulsive. The literal removal of Jews during Holocaust from the horizon of everyday life depersonalized them and turned them into an example of an abstract category instead of individual persons. This can explain why most Germans in Nazi Germany supported the anti-Jewish laws, but still reacted negatively to obvious and visible violence against Jews. And so this might also help explain why most people in society today support the animal industry, but still frown upon visible violence against animals, as we see in the cases of whaling or the killing of the baby giraffe in Copenhagen Zoo. But the morally inconsistent relationship with other animals isn't that simple, so that it can be understood as a question of visibility alone, which the famous Paul McCartney quote otherwise would imply. If slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian. Before industrialization, it was common practice in Western societies to slaughter animals in the middle of the streets, a practice that is still not uncommon in other parts of the world. And I must make a small trigger warning that there will be a picture of a dead animal in the next slide. And hunters are also a living proof that visibility of violence in itself isn't enough to make the killing of animals evoke moral disgust. Even like in this case where the animal is a giraffe like Marius, the baby giraffe. And a lot of ethical vegans who at some point in their lives have opened their eyes and hearts for animal suffering still give up their veganism and go back to eating animals again, even though the violence has been visible for them. And interestingly, in the recent years, a new tendency has arisen where the killing of animals has again become visible in commercials, television shows, cookbooks, etc. This tendency has been called new carnivorism, and you would imagine that it should be applauded by animal rights activists who for decades have been working on making the hidden violence of the slaughterhouses visible to the public. But new carnivorism has not resulted in a decrease in meat consumption or a shift in animals' moral status. Rather, according to researcher Jovian Perry, it helps to further naturalize and justify human domination and violence against other animals. As Perry pessimistically concludes, the slaughterhouse walls may have become somewhat transparent with the rise of new carnivorism, but the slaughter continues unabated. So even though the question of visibility is certainly of great importance to the morally inconsistent relationship with other animals, it's clearly much more complex than this, and making the violence visible in itself is not enough. The final mechanism, gradualistic moral disengagement, it refers to the fact that moral disengagement often happens progressively by performing the harmful acts again and again, and by repetition they won't invoke the same discomfort. Slaughterhouse workers often describe how the job was very difficult for them in the beginning, but that they get used to it over time. And this mechanism is also valuable in understanding carnists' moral disengagement towards the animals they eat. Since far most people have been eating animals since early childhood, which means that they have performed the harmful act countless of times, and thus they have become gradually more and more morally disengaged. So, to sum it up, according to Bandura's theory, there are lots of factors surrounding the animal industry that support moral disengagement and thus make it possible for people to act against their moral values without feeling bad about it. And now, finally, I'll end my speech by summing up some of the main points from my presentation that I think are the most important to keep in mind when we're doing activism. And this might be talking to friends about veganism or doing leafleting, writing text, campaigns, etc. So, how can we use these insights to try to create a better world for all animals? First of all, I think we should, as many of you probably already know, bring forward the stories of individual animals in our campaigns, rather than pointing to statistics and numbers that show that so and so many animals are killed, etc. It's much easier to empathize with a single individual than it is to empathize with even two individuals. So this is of great importance. And this also counteracts the industry's attempts to de-individualize and anonymize the animals by presenting them as exactly the unique individuals they are. And furthermore, we should be trying more directly to invoke empathy by literally asking the recipient of our message to, let's say in a flyer, to imagine themselves in the victim's place. This has been shown to evoke more empathy than just listening to the victim's story. And since our empathy is plagued by familiarity and in-group biases, I think it's very important to work to minimize the perceived intergroup differences between humans and other animals, and between some groups of animals and other groups of animals. And since our empathy is a limited resource and we simply cannot be empathic with all beings all the time, I believe it's important that we in our materials, together with trying to invoke empathy for one individual, also connect this empathy with a moral principle of not causing harm to others in general, which of course implies veganism. And finally, I think it's important that we don't shame people for being morally inconsistent. First of all, because after all the things I've presented to you today, I think that you can't really blame people that they are morally inconsistent. And when people show genuine acts of empathy and compassion by grieving the death of one animal or becoming outraged by the killing of another animal, even though they still eat lots of other animals, I think that instead of shaming them, we should acknowledge their authentic empathy and encourage them to expand this empathy to include more animals than just their companion animals or whales or a baby giraffe. And this was the end of my speech. Thank you.
So thank you, Simon, for your interesting talk. Do we have any questions? You have a question? Yes.
I just wanted to know if you've seen differences in the reactions you get from the people you talk to since coming to these conclusions. Like, do you get visibly more people agreeing with you when you have this in mind while talking to them? Non-vegans, that is.
I came to these conclusions in the spring, so I haven't had so much, at least not so much campaigning experience with them, but I have tried actually to change my approach when I talk to people. And also in my organization, Go Vegan, we have tried to build it into our new materials to tone down the rational arguments a bit and just focus on the empathic aspect. And my idea until now is that it has a bigger effect, but still I think that the rational arguments are important. But I think it's easier to get people on the hook in some way if you try to make them feel empathy for one animal in the beginning. But sometimes, I mean, it's hard. It can also seem a bit too like you're trying to press something down in people's throat by saying, imagine you're an animal. And then, so you have to do it in a way that doesn't seem too like pressing or yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, is there another question?
Actually, I have two questions. My first question is, you started your talk. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really, really, really good. And I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are two questions. The first one, you were talking about we have irrational minds. And what I didn't quite understand is, are we born with an empty mind, which is then filled with suggestions of eating meat, or do we have a presupposition that we are born into this world and we are either for or against? I remember when I was growing up, the butcher convinced me to eat sausages because they were growing on trees, because I didn't want to eat meat. And it's been a question for me all along whether children want to eat meat or not. And my experience is that children don't necessarily want to eat meat, but they are being brought to eating meat. First question. Second question is, what would you say about punishment, social punishment, because meat is also associated with Easter and certain feasts, and if you are becoming vegan, it's very difficult to then integrate into the group. You're even more excluded, and that's a kind of punishment. And if you have some comments on that.
The first one is a tough question, I think. I don't believe that we are born as tabula rasa, blank sheets. I think we definitely are born with a lot of biological preconditions, and that's also part of Jonathan Hyde's theory, that he says that we have these innate moral intuitions from birth, but the culture can influence them, and the culture can foster certain of these intuitions and downplay some of the others. So I think most children don't want to eat animals, but I think through culture they learn to kind of suppress this intuition, or it doesn't get nourished, this intuition, so then they learn to just eat meat without getting this intuition. Then I don't know if it answered your question. And the other question, what was it? How to avoid being socially?
Or whatever, and then you're not part of the group anymore. So this punishment is an extreme punishment to some extent, and people you talk to who want to give up meat think about these possible punishments, exclusion from the family, exclusion from the community, and to what extent that plays into this cycle that you were describing. And in addition to which, also religion, because religion is a higher authority, and that is very much associated, religious feasts, with meat eating.
Yeah, but I think, if I understand it right, that the thing is that, yeah, people have empathy and they don't want to harm others and they don't want to harm animals, basically, but we have a lot of other drives and things that matter to us, and it's a very big drive for most people to fit into the social group, and so that's also some kind of an empathic impulse, I would say, that if you're with other human persons and they feel alienated from you, then you don't want them to, you don't like to be that person who makes other people feel like that. So I guess that's also empathy that makes you want to fit in some way, but so your empathy can be split, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, do we have another question? Could you come up here, because we only have a cable here and it's not that long.
Hey. Earlier on you were talking about the beef jerky experiment. Could you just explain it again, because I didn't quite follow it when you were talking about it?
Yeah. The study was that participants were asked to write down the mental capacities of a range of non-human animals and the moral worth of a range of non-human animals. And before the study started, then they were divided into two groups. They didn't know this. And one group had beef jerky in the room before they went to do the survey, and the other participants had nuts. And the study showed that the participants who just ate meat, they decreased their moral concern for all animals in general, and they also decreased specifically their ascription of cognitive capacities to cows. So, yeah. So people are definitely motivated when they try to come up with these rationalizations to eat animals.
Okay, is there another question? Could you come up? Okay.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And afterwards you learn that you harmed somebody, but you've done it so often that it seems normal.
Yeah, and I think we also have a tendency to we like to see ourselves as good persons, of course. So if you have been doing something for all your life, then it's really hard to look back and say, okay, maybe I wasn't such a great person as I thought I was, and yeah.
Another question? Okay. I'll try and come over there.
What do you think are some practical ways we can implement these ideas? Do you think it's leafleting or TV ads, or what do you think are some practical ways to include this in our activism?
I think, the things I've focused most on is like person-to-person kind of activism. So I think it is by when you talk to friends and families, like the everyday activism and leafleting and campaign sites, but maybe also if you get media, if you have a breakthrough to the media, then I think you might also consider these things that in the short amount of time you probably get in a news story, then you might choose to focus on a single animal story instead of just talking about numbers.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is another question.
Do you think that it is more it's a good idea to bring people to not eating meat by showing them how healthy vegan food can be, and then they skip meat and leave it out of their diet, and afterwards you can come up with the empathy. Yeah.
I guess if it works, it works. I don't feel like I have the solution to how to make people.
Yeah, it's you're not a beef jerky thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess it might break down some barriers if you get people to stop eating animals. Then yeah, I certainly think the psychological theories would support that. If you get people to stop for whatever reason, then it might be easier to convince them about animal rights afterwards.
All right, then thank you so much, Simon, for your great talk. Thanks.